He thought humiliating her would make him look powerful, but he had no idea he had just stepped into the biggest mistake of his career. The glass doors of the dealership slid open with a soft hiss as Maggie Collins stepped inside, her worn sneakers barely making a sound against the polished marble floors that reflected rows of six-figure cars gleaming under bright showroom lights. At 35, she carried herself with a quiet steadiness, dressed in simple blue jeans and a plain white t-shirt, the kind of outfit most people wouldn't look twice at. And that was exactly what happened as she walked in, unnoticed, unwelcomed, invisible. Across the showroom, Blake Thompson adjusted his tailored navy suit and glanced up, his eyes scanning her from head to toe in a single dismissive sweep before returning to a well-dressed couple he was entertaining, his smile instantly warmer, sharper, reserved for those he deemed worthy. Maggie paused near a midnight blue coupe displayed on a raised platform, its price tag just over $300,000, her gaze calm, thoughtful, as if she were choosing something meaningful rather than dreaming beyond her reach. She waited, patient, as seconds stretched, then minutes, while sales staff passed her by, offering polite greetings to others, their voices bright and attentive, yet never once acknowledging her presence. Blake let out a short, humorless laugh, the sound echoing faintly across the marble floor. "Then I'd suggest you take a look at our used inventory down the street," he added, louder now, ensuring others could hear. "This isn't really a browsing space." The room grew subtly quieter, attention gathering like a slow-moving spotlight, as Maggie met his gaze for just a brief second, her eyes steady, unreadable, before she said something so simple, so controlled, it almost slipped past unnoticed. "Thank you for showing me exactly who you are." And then she turned, walking toward the exit with the same quiet composure she had entered with, the glass doors closing behind her as a faint hush lingered in the air. But what no one in that showroom realized, not even Blake as he straightened his tie with a satisfied smirk, was that by this time tomorrow, everything they thought they understood about power, status, and respect would be completely undone. By the time Maggie stepped out into the afternoon sunlight, the noise of the showroom had already faded behind her, replaced by a quiet stillness that matched the expression on her face. Not anger, not embarrassment, but something far more unsettling, a calm that came from understanding exactly what had just happened and what it meant. She walked across the parking lot without rushing, her reflection briefly catching in the polished surface of a black SUV as it pulled in, its driver stepping out quickly to greet a sharply dressed customer, a contrast so immediate it almost felt staged. Yet Maggie did not look back. Inside the dealership, the rhythm resumed almost instantly, laughter returning, conversations picking up where they left off, as if the moment had been nothing more than a minor interruption, something already dismissed and forgotten. Blake adjusted his cufflinks, his posture loosening as he leaned toward the couple he had been assisting, his voice smooth again, confident, certain, explaining horsepower and custom interiors as though nothing of consequence had occurred. But there was a flicker in his expression, brief and almost invisible, the kind that came when someone replayed a moment in their mind and could not quite explain why it lingered. "Did you see her face?" one of the junior salesmen whispered under his breath near the front desk, a quiet chuckle following, while another shook his head with a grin, the atmosphere feeding on itself, reinforcing the same quiet hierarchy that had just played out. Yet not everyone joined in. Daniel, a younger salesman who had tried to approach Maggie earlier, stood slightly apart, his brows drawn together, watching the door she had exited through as if something about the exchange did not sit right with him. Though he said nothing, the unspoken tension settling quietly beneath the surface of the room. Hours passed, customers came and went, deals were discussed, numbers negotiated, and by the time the evening light stretched long across the showroom floor, the earlier scene had become little more than a passing anecdote, retold with smirks and casual exaggeration, each version making it seem smaller, less important, easier to dismiss. Blake left that night with the same confidence he carried every day, his footsteps echoing across the marble as he locked up, satisfied with the sales he had closed, convinced he had handled the situation exactly as he should have, unaware that the single moment he had chosen to assert control would soon define how others saw him in a way he could not reverse. Across town, in a quiet neighborhood where streetlights cast a soft glow over tree-lined sidewalks. Maggie sat by the window of her modest home, a small lamp illuminating the table beside her, her phone resting within reach, untouched, as if she were allowing the silence to settle before anything else began. Her expression remained composed, thoughtful, her mind not on the humiliation itself, but on the clarity it had given her, the way a single interaction could reveal more about a person than any introduction ever could. She reached for her phone at last, not with hesitation, but with quiet certainty, her fingers moving with practiced ease as she scrolled to a familiar name, the screen lighting up her face in the dim room. Somewhere else in the city, a man in a tailored suit stepped out of a late meeting, his phone vibrating just as he reached his car, and the moment he saw her name appear, everything else seemed to pause, because he knew, without needing to hear a single word yet, that whatever had happened that day was about to change everything by morning. Daniel Collins did not answer the call immediately, and that alone was unusual, because he always answered her, but when he finally did, his voice was calm, steady, carrying the quiet authority of someone who was used to being listened to without needing to raise his tone. Maggie did not begin with emotion. She did not describe the embarrassment or the laughter or the way the room had turned against her. Instead, she simply told him what happened, detail by detail, her words measured, precise, as if she were laying out facts in a way that required no interpretation. On the other end of the line, Daniel said nothing at first, and the silence stretched just long enough to feel heavier than any reaction could have been, because it was not the kind of silence that came from confusion. It was the kind that came from understanding exactly what had taken place. He asked only one question when she finished, his voice lower now, more focused. Which dealership? Maggie gave him the name without hesitation, and for a brief moment, the quiet hum of the city around him seemed to disappear entirely as he processed it, his gaze lifting toward the skyline, the reflection of glass towers stretching endlessly into the night. All right, he said after a pause, simple, controlled, but carrying a weight that did not need explanation. I will handle it. Maggie did not ask what that meant, because she already knew, not in specifics, but in certainty, and that was enough. After the call ended, Daniel remained standing beside his car for a moment longer, his phone still in his hand, the faint glow of the screen illuminating the sharp lines of his expression as something shifted behind his eyes, not anger, not impulse, but intention, calculated and deliberate. He stepped into the vehicle and closed the door quietly, the interior dimly lit, the soft leather seats and polished wood accents reflecting the kind of environment where decisions were made that carried far beyond a single moment. Across town, the dealership sat dark under the evening sky, its glass walls now reflecting only streetlights and passing headlights, everything inside still, silent, unaware of what had been set into motion. The next morning would begin like any other, or at least that is what Blake believed as he arrived early, coffee in hand, greeting staff with the same confidence he always carried, already discussing potential clients and projected numbers for the day. The showroom lights flickered on one by one, illuminating the cars. In perfect symmetry, each one positioned to impress, to signal status, to create the illusion that value could be measured in price tags alone. Daniel, the younger salesman, arrived shortly after, his mind briefly returning to the woman from the day before, though he pushed the thought aside as the pace of work picked up, conversations overlapping, the sound of polished shoes against marble echoing faintly through the space. And then, just as the morning settled into its rhythm, a subtle shift began outside, almost too quiet to notice at first, the low, unmistakable hum of an engine that did not belong to ordinary traffic, a sound that carried a different kind of presence, one that drew attention without demanding it, and as the first employee near the window paused and turned, the reflection of a sleek silhouette gliding into the lot appeared across the glass, smooth, deliberate, undeniable, and in that moment, without a single word spoken, the air inside the dealership began to change. The engine did not roar, it did not announce itself loudly, but the moment it came to a smooth, effortless stop in front of the dealership, everyone felt it, the kind of presence that did not need noise to command attention. Conversation slowed, then faltered, as heads turned almost in unison toward the glass walls, where the sleek, unmistakable silhouette of a Rolls-Royce Phantom rested beneath the morning light, its polished surface reflecting the entire showroom back at itself like a mirror of everything that was about to change. A junior salesman near the entrance instinctively straightened his tie, while another hurried toward the door, his posture shifting instantly from casual to precise, because vehicles like that did not arrive without purpose, and they certainly did not arrive without expectation. Blake noticed the shift a second later, his voice trailing off mid-sentence as he followed the direction of everyone's gaze. And for the briefest moment, something flickered across his face, curiosity first, then calculation, as he set his coffee aside and adjusted his jacket, preparing to greet what he assumed would be a high-value client. The glass doors opened smoothly, and the outside air slipped in, cool and quiet, as the driver stepped out first, moving with practiced efficiency to open the rear door, the gesture alone enough to signal that whoever sat inside was not just important, but accustomed to being treated as such. The room fell into a subtle hush, the kind that builds without being announced, as if the entire space understood that something significant was unfolding. Blake moved forward with a polished smile already in place, his tone ready to shift into its most refined version, the one reserved for individuals who fit his definition of success. But then the door opened fully, and time seemed to pause for just a fraction longer than it should have. A polished shoe touched the pavement first, followed by the crisp line of a tailored suit. Daniel Collins stepping out with the kind of quiet authority that did not ask for attention, yet received it instantly, his presence commanding without effort, his expression composed, unreadable. A ripple of recognition moved through the staff, subtle but undeniable, as whispers formed beneath breaths, names exchanged quietly, the realization spreading faster than anyone intended. Blake's smile widened, now edged with something closer to eagerness, as he stepped forward, ready to greet him personally. But before he could speak, Daniel did something unexpected. He did not walk toward the entrance. He did not acknowledge the dealership at all. Instead, he turned slightly, his attention still focused on the open door behind him. And then she stepped out. The same woman. The same simple jeans. The same calm posture. The same quiet presence that had been dismissed less than a day before. Except now the entire context had shifted in a way that no one could ignore. Maggie Collins stood beside the Rolls-Royce, not as someone arriving alone, not as someone hoping to be acknowledged, but as someone being received, her presence anchored within a reality that the showroom had completely failed to recognize. The air inside tightened, conversations collapsing into silence as eyes moved rapidly between her and Daniel, trying to reconcile what they were seeing with what they believed they understood. Blake froze mid-step, the words he had prepared dissolving before they could form, his expression caught somewhere between disbelief and realization as the moment settled heavily over him. Because in that instant, it was no longer about a customer walking in, it was about a mistake returning, fully revealed, and impossible to undo. No one spoke at first, not because they did not want to, but because no one could quite find the words that would make sense of what they were seeing. The same woman who had been dismissed, redirected, and quietly removed from the space, now standing at the center of attention, without saying a single word. Maggie stepped forward beside Daniel with the same calm presence she had carried the day before, her eyes moving across the showroom not with resentment, but with clarity, as if she were seeing everything exactly as it was for the first time. The polished floors, the gleaming cars, the carefully curated displays, none of it had changed, and yet everything felt different. Blake remained frozen for a fraction too long before forcing himself forward, his smile returning, though now it carried a stiffness that had not been there before, his voice attempting to recover its polished tone as he addressed Daniel first. "Sir, welcome. It is an honor to have you here." But even as he spoke, his gaze flickered toward Maggie, recognition settling in fully, undeniable, unavoidable. Daniel did not respond immediately, his attention shifting instead to Maggie, a subtle gesture that did not go unnoticed by anyone in the room, because in that moment, it became clear who this visit was truly for. Maggie met Blake's eyes briefly, not with anger, not with triumph, but with a steady composure that made the silence around them feel heavier than any accusation could have been. "I came back to take another look at the coupe," she said calmly, her voice the same as it had been the day before. unchanged, as if nothing about her had shifted, even though everything else had. A few employees exchanged glances, their expressions tightening, the memory of yesterday replaying itself in real time against the present. Blake cleared his throat, stepping slightly to the side, his posture now attentive, almost eager. Of course, absolutely, we would be happy to show you anything you like. The contrast in his tone unmistakable, the same man, the same voice, but an entirely different attitude. The room held its breath as Maggie walked past him without haste, moving toward the display platform where the midnight blue coupe still sat under the bright lights, untouched, pristine, waiting. Daniel followed just a step behind her, his presence quiet but undeniable, and the employees who had once ignored her now watched every movement, their attention sharp, careful, as if trying to correct something that had already been set in stone. Maggie ran, her fingers lightly along the edge of the car, not with excitement, but with consideration, as though the object itself mattered far less than the moment surrounding it. "It is a beautiful car," she said softly, almost to herself, and Blake nodded quickly, stepping closer, eager to explain features, specifications, anything that might restore his position. "Yes, it is one of our most exclusive models, handcrafted interior, custom performance package. It is truly exceptional." His words flowing faster now, his confidence replaced by urgency. Maggie listened, then turned slightly, her gaze meeting his again, and for a second, the entire showroom seemed to narrow to that single exchange. "Yesterday," she said, her tone still calm, "you told me this was not a place for someone like me." The words landed without force, yet they echoed louder than anything else that had been said, because everyone in the room had heard them before, whether directly or indirectly, and now they were being spoken again, in a context that could not be ignored. Blake's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out immediately, his expression tightening as realization fully settled over him, the weight of his own words returning in a way he could not deflect, could not reshape. The room went completely silent, the kind of silence that does not ask for attention but demands it, and in that stillness, the difference between who he thought she was and who she actually was became impossible to ignore. Blake felt the weight of every eye in the room settle on him, not with sympathy, not even with judgment, but with expectation, the kind that demanded an answer he no longer had control over. His throat tightened slightly as he forced a smile that did not reach his eyes, his voice catching for just a fraction before he managed to speak. "I believe there must have been a misunderstanding." But even as the words left his mouth, they sounded hollow, thin, as if they could not hold against the memory of what had actually happened. Maggie did not react immediately. She did not interrupt. She simply watched him, her expression calm, patient, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough for everyone else to feel it, to sit inside it, to recognize the difference between an excuse and the truth. Around them, the staff stood completely still, no one daring to move, no one willing to step in, because this was no longer a sales interaction. It was something far more revealing, something that could not be undone by polite language or rehearsed professionalism. Daniel remained beside her, his presence steady, his gaze fixed on Blake, not aggressive, not confrontational, but unwavering, the kind of look that did not need to raise its voice to carry authority. Maggie finally spoke, her tone even, measured. "You were very clear yesterday," she said, her words precise. "There was no confusion in what you meant." The statement settled over the room like a quiet verdict, and for a moment, Blake had nowhere to go, no space to redirect, no version of the situation he could reshape into something acceptable. He nodded quickly, almost too quickly, as if agreeing might lessen the impact. "Of course, and I sincerely apologize if anything I said came across in the wrong way." But again, the phrasing betrayed him, because it suggested perception rather than responsibility, and everyone could hear it. Maggie's eyes remained steady, and she took a small step closer to the car, her hand resting lightly against its surface, grounding the moment in something tangible. "I was ready to purchase this vehicle yesterday," she continued, her voice soft but clear. "I asked simple questions, and I was treated as though I did not belong here." A faint shift moved through the employees, a subtle tightening of posture, a quiet recognition of how easily the situation could have gone differently. Blake swallowed, his confidence slipping further. "We value all of our customers," he said. The words automatic now, practiced, but lacking conviction, because the contrast between his statement and his actions stood too clearly in front of him. Daniel took a single step forward then, not interrupting, but reinforcing the moment, his voice calm, deliberate. "The question is not what you say you value," he said. "It is what you show when you believe no one important is watching." The room went completely still again, the kind of silence that carried weight, that pressed into every corner of the showroom, leaving no space untouched. Maggie glanced briefly at Daniel, then back at Blake, her expression unchanged, not seeking an apology, not demanding anything at all, which somehow made the moment even more difficult to stand in. She turned her attention back to the car, her fingers tracing the line of its design for a brief second before she stepped back, creating a small distance between herself and the object that had started it all. "It is still a beautiful car," she said quietly, and for a moment, it sounded as though she might proceed, as though the situation could still be salvaged, but then she looked up again, meeting Blake's eyes one last time, and in that look, there was something final, something resolved, something that made it clear that whatever decision came next would not be about the car at all. Blake waited, holding on to the fragile hope that she might still proceed, that the situation could somehow be smoothed over, rewritten into something manageable. But the longer Maggie remained silent, the clearer it became that this moment was not going to follow the script he was used to controlling. She stepped back fully from the car now, creating a visible distance, not just from the vehicle, but from the entire interaction. Her posture relaxed, composed, as if she had already made her decision long before anyone else realized it. The showroom seemed to hold its breath, every employee watching for the next move, the next word, the moment that would determine whether this would end as a recovery or a collapse. Maggie turned slightly toward Daniel, and without a word between them, something passed, an understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud, and then she looked back at Blake with the same steady gaze that had never wavered. "I will not be purchasing this car," she said quietly, her voice calm, but carrying through the entire room with unmistakable clarity. The words landed harder than any raised voice could have, because they were final, absolute, leaving no space for negotiation, no opportunity for correction. A subtle shift rippled through the staff, the realization spreading quickly, not just of the lost sale, but of what it represented, a moment that could have been one of the most significant transactions of the year, now gone, not because of price or product, but because of a single decision made in seconds. Blake felt his chest tighten as he stepped forward instinctively, his tone changing again, now edged with urgency. "Ma'am, please, I assure you we can make this right. We can offer you priority service, any customization you would like." The words coming faster now, less controlled, as if he could rebuild the moment through sheer effort. But Maggie did not move, did not respond immediately, allowing his words to settle into the silence, where they seemed to lose their strength the longer they lingered. "It is not about the car," she said after a pause, her voice softer now, but somehow even more impactful. "It is about how easily you decided who I was before I even spoke." No one in the room looked away now, because the truth in her words was too direct, too clear to ignore. Daniel stepped slightly closer beside her, his presence reinforcing the weight of the moment, his voice calm, measured. "Opportunities do not always announce themselves in a way you expect," he said, his eyes on Blake. "And when you miss them, they do not come back the same way twice." The silence that followed was complete, the kind that settled deeply, leaving no room for distraction, no escape from what had just been said. Maggie glanced once more at the car, her expression unchanged, then turned toward the exit, her movement unhurried, deliberate, as if she had all the time in the world, while behind her, the entire showroom seemed to stand still, watching something they could not reverse unfold in real time. The glass doors opened again, letting in the quiet morning air, and as she stepped outside, the light caught the surface of the Rolls Royce waiting for her, a reflection of everything that had been misunderstood just hours before. Daniel paused for a brief moment, his gaze returning to Blake one last time, not with anger, not with judgment, but with a calm finality that made the message unmistakable. And then he turned and followed her out, leaving behind a room that felt entirely different from the one they had entered, where the absence of a single decision now echoed louder than any sale ever could. The glass doors closed softly behind them, and for a moment, no one inside the showroom moved, as if the entire space had been paused and forgotten, the echo of what had just happened lingering heavier than any conversation could replace. Blake remained standing exactly where he was, his hands slightly tense at his sides, his mind racing through every second of the last 24 hours, replaying each word, each glance, each decision, now stripped of the confidence that had once justified them. Around him, the staff slowly began to shift, but something had changed, not just in the atmosphere, but in the way they looked at him, quieter now, more measured, as if the certainty he carried had been replaced by something far less stable. Daniel, the younger salesman, lowered his gaze briefly before turning back toward the showroom floor, though his expression carried a new awareness, the kind that comes when someone sees a moment clearly for what it truly is. Outside, the Rolls-Royce door closed with a soft, solid sound, and as the car pulled away from the dealership, its movement smooth and effortless, it left behind a silence that felt almost deliberate, as if it were giving the building time to absorb what had just unfolded. Inside, the normal rhythm did not return immediately, conversations starting and stopping, voices quieter, less certain, because no one could ignore the fact that something significant had just slipped through their hands, something that had been offered without announcement and lost without hesitation. Blake finally exhaled slowly, running a hand over his tie as if adjusting it could restore some sense of control, but the gesture felt empty, disconnected from the reality settling around him. A senior manager stepped out from an office at the back, having observed enough to understand the situation without needing an explanation, his expression composed but serious as he looked toward Blake, not with anger, but with a level of disappointment that carried far more weight. "What happened here?" he asked quietly, though the answer was already visible in every corner of the room. Blake opened his mouth, searching for a version of events that might soften the truth, but nothing came that did not sound insufficient, incomplete, and in that hesitation, the reality became undeniable. "We lost a client," the manager said after a moment, his voice calm, but final, and then he added, almost as an afterthought, "and not just any client." The words settled deeply, not because of their volume, but because of what they implied, the ripple effect that would extend beyond a single missed sale, into reputation, into trust, into the quiet network of decisions that determined who was welcomed and who was not. Blake nodded slightly, though the motion lacked conviction, his earlier certainty replaced by a growing awareness that this was not something he could simply move past. Across the showroom, a few employees avoided eye contact, while others glanced briefly before returning to their tasks, each reaction subtle, but collectively forming a shift that could not be undone. Outside, the city moved on as it always did, cars passing, people walking, unaware of the small but significant moment that had just taken place, yet inside those glass walls, the lesson remained, quiet but undeniable, woven into the space itself. And for the first time, Blake understood that what had been lost was not just a sale, not just a number on a report, but something far more difficult to measure, something that once gone, could not simply be earned back with effort or time, because respect, once dismissed, does not return the same way twice. The showroom never fully returned to what it had been, not that day, and not in the days that followed, because something invisible had shifted, something that could not be reset by turning on lights or greeting new customers with practiced smiles. Blake continued to stand behind his desk, but the way he stood had changed, his posture less certain, his voice more measured, as if every word now carried a second layer of awareness that had not existed before. Customers still came in, still asked questions, still walked through the polished rows of vehicles, but there was a subtle difference in how Blake responded, a hesitation that appeared in the smallest moments, a pause before judgment, a second glance where there had once been none. Across the room, Daniel watched quietly, saying little, but observing everything, because he had seen the moment when assumption turned into consequence, and he understood that not everyone was given the chance to learn from it so clearly. The manager's words lingered long after they were spoken, not repeated, not emphasized, yet present in every decision that followed, shaping the atmosphere in ways no one openly acknowledged. Meanwhile, across town, Maggie sat once again by her window, the same soft light illuminating the room. But this time there was no uncertainty in her expression, no need to reflect on what had happened, because for her, the moment had already served its purpose. She had not returned for revenge, not for validation, but for clarity, and she had found it in the simplest way possible, by allowing the truth to reveal itself without force. Daniel sat across from her, reviewing a message on his phone, a quiet confirmation that the dealership had already begun to feel the impact, not through confrontation, but through absence, through the quiet network of choices that determine where people decide to bring their business and where they do not. He set the phone down without comment, because nothing needed to be said, the outcome already understood between them. Back at the dealership, Blake stood near the entrance as a new customer walked in, dressed casually, almost identically to how Maggie had been, and for a brief moment, everything slowed again, the memory returning with unmistakable clarity. This time, he stepped forward immediately, his tone respectful, his attention genuine, not because he recognized who the person might be, but because he no longer assumed who they were not. The difference was subtle, almost invisible to anyone else, but it was there, shaped by a single moment that had rewritten something deeper than sales strategy. The glass doors opened and closed as they always did. The city continued moving beyond them, but inside, the lesson remained, quiet, persistent, woven into every interaction that followed. And somewhere within that stillness, it became clear that the most powerful changes are not the ones announced loudly, but the ones that settle silently, altering the way a person sees others long after the moment itself has passed. Because in the end, what defines us is not how we treat those who can benefit us, but how we treat those we believe cannot. And that is something no title, no price tag, and no apology can ever fully undo once it has been revealed.